So I thought maybe I'd get a chance to chat with you all about the what I call the UAP Hilbert problems, which in some sense are an intent to suggest a way forward on the phenomenon. And so the idea, and a lot of people probably know David Hilbert, right? So famous German mathematician. He is the namesake for Hilbert space, which was the idea of formalizing the ability of differentiable functions to multiple dimensions. He framed 10 problems that formed the basis and direction for theoretical mathematics for over a century. And so we're sort of kind of suggesting the problems might align in that same vein. It's interesting, though, the problems still remain. There's actually 23 that he ultimately ended up publishing, and there was a 24th that was posthumous. And over time, people solved a lot of these. Some of them were actually solved quite quickly. Some were determined to be like insoluble. So in some sense, what we're saying is even Hilbert didn't quite get the problems right, but it still had a benefit to kind of frame the way forward. So that's sort of the idea here. And so I would submit that we're trying to accomplish the restoration of proper elected official oversight on the topic, progress on the topic in terms of scientific advancement, and this idea of controlled disclosure, which is a way to mitigate the potential for catastrophic consequences. So you can see from a policy standpoint and from an information standpoint, the idea that there's got to be a control group that's recreated to manage this function. So the problem is, like, how do you actually do that? And how do you actually centralize information on the topic such that progress can be made? And so the UAP Disclosure Act was intending to do that with the UAP Review Board. And what actually ended up getting passed technically last year is the idea of consolidating all the records at the National Archive. Unfortunately, the definitions were dropped, so the subject matter, the content, the scope of that archive is really probably continues to be a little suspect. But so that's sort of the first two problems. They still remain to be solved, ultimately, is what I'm saying. The second one, or the third one, is basically your finance. And so the idea of the financial piece is really how do you incentivize grant money to maybe impact this problem so the academic community can get engaged in a more aggressive way. And so that's probably some reforms that are going to be required through the National Science Foundation. And then if you think about ultimately trying to move into the diplomatic sphere, you've got to kind of understand not only like the domestic side of the equation, but you have to understand the foreign policy side. And so the idea of what would it take to understand the public and private positions of every government with respect to the topic, as well as the state of affairs, perhaps, of any RDT&E, research, development, test, evaluation programs of a foreign nation. So there's this thing called an NIE, National Intel Estimate, that might do that. And then ultimately, that might lead to an international forum like the Reagan-Gorbachev Forum or the World Congress of Religions that might ultimately end up trying to address, sort of a whole planet issue. Something up. So that's maybe the government line of effort, Hilbert problems. Like, how do we get a handle from a government standpoint? But a lot of folks, are probably more interested in what might happen, both in the humanities. And so we've got 6 problems. And so the idea with the humanities, number one would be like sort of administrative. How do you set up an administrative structure that the academy can engage on this topic? And so, I mean, obviously folks in the audience are going to have probably a much better idea how to do that than I might. But as a going-in position, maybe you'd want to create specialties within these existing disciplines and ultimately, endow chairs and heads of departments that would sort of support this effort. So that's sort of a big ask, but the Hilbert problems weren't necessarily that easy to begin with. So the idea maybe would be, instead of creating a degree program on UAP or having a specific set of lectures on UAP, it becomes like sort of a specialty of each of the disciplines. And let's see, are we on the right side? So the ethical piece is also an interesting one. And we've got like a theory of ethics based on this, the fundamental principle of like do no harm and do the greatest good. And in some sense, that seems to presuppose actors with equal competitive potential in terms of their effectiveness in navigating the society. And so if the norm is a hierarchy of being where you've got non-human intelligence that might be more advanced, technologically more evolved, in terms of their development, it would seem that in concert with that would become a greater responsibility to protect. So the idea of conservation laws driving a competition is balanced by the idea that greater capability would really bring a moral responsibility as well. Just like we've got laws of armed conflict where there's sort of limits on what you can do. If NHI exists, has it interacted with humanity over time, right? So it's sort of an open question. This is the classic chariots of the gods sort of scenario. Well, I wouldn't necessarily endorse any of the the use cases in that book. The question still presents itself if NHI exists, and whether we count it in the future or whether we encounter it in the present, you'd want to know, has there been interaction in the past? Mm-hmm. And so it would, I think, behoove historians and cultural anthropologists to sort of look into that, because that's something we'd want to understand our own human condition.
Well, what kind of discontinuities would you expect to see that would represent something in the past?
Well, so it's interesting to sort of throw out sort of this interesting hypothetical. They recently, there's this idea of out-of-place artifacts, right, mm-hmm. that you probably heard about. And so there's pre-dynastic Egyptian vases that date to 3000 BC. And Flinders Petrie actually found these. Mm-hmm. And they're kind of hoarded in Zoser's pyramid, mm-hmm. so it dates to 3rd, 4th dynasty. And you've got 10,000 of them in there. And they've got some of these in the Egyptian Museum. And they're the ones that I'm talking about, they're made out of granite and schist, corundum, which is one level below or diamond in the hardness. Mm. Well, they've been around for years. Flinders Petrie found them in the 1890s. They finally decided to mensurate one, with lasers, strain gauges, and they determined that the profile is accurate within 1,000th of an inch of a mathematical equation. So, you can't make this object by hand.
Was it round? It couldn't be accomplished on a lathe?
Right, but the diameters correspond to a closed-form algorithm.
Oh, okay.
Right, and the features of the vase, the fillets, the rounds, it has handles on it. You've got to have a 3-axis or 4-axis milling machine to make this. And it's made out of granite. They've got others that are schist, so they're very brittle. They got some out of corundum. So nobody really knows how this is made. The Egyptologists basically say that they made it with grounding powder and on a potter's wheel or something. But it's impossible to make this object in that way. So that doesn't mean it's NHI, obviously, but it means that the scientific community hasn't engaged with that object, and there's either an entire material culture associated with that is lost, like the Antikythera mechanism. Had we not found that, nobody would believe that they could make that.
Right.
So I think that what we're saying here in this history, problem is some of these things deserve a relook, and to understand where we came from, we probably need to do that. Let's see. How about religious studies? So I was privileged to be on a talk with Daniel Pasulka at a recent conference, and we talked a little bit about how the Orthodox faith traditions are very dissimilar, but the more esoteric versions have some similarity. And through this sort of initiatic experience, and so one wonders, as a lot of experiencers report, altered states of consciousness and near-death experience encounters, was there any interaction in the past in terms of religion, and what would that mean? Have NHI interacted in that way, and that become public, and what would that mean ultimately for government disclosure, right? So there's maybe a linkage there.
Well, you could imagine the legs of, if certain legs of certain religions get pulled out from underneath them, there would be considerable accusations of heathenism.
Right. And so this is the potential for also the societal disruption aspect. And so, it remains to be seen if any of that's true, but as a responsible policymaker, you'd have to probably entertain that. So this is a problem that would be great to definitively resolve it perhaps in the negative.
But I want to challenge this whole notion of hysteria that, I think unfortunately for most of the world's population, they're too busy putting bread on the table. And so to the extent that it would be news for a certain cycle or period of time, I don't think it would change people's need to continue to put bread on the table. You know, if anything, they will say, well, I don't have time to deal with that right now. So that to me is a sort of a buffer in the system. And then what would be the questions that we ask of it to help it give us an answer? Like, is there a discontinuity in the historical record that would, you know, do, or I get asked this question a lot, you know, is there a hybrid program? And as a geneticist, my answer is, even if there was, it would be so sophisticated you'd never see it in the data because it's just too complicated to expect to find that. So don't ask me.
Right, right. Well, in some sense too, like the sort of the statistical analysis that says, you know, what's the, you know, we hear about UFO waves and UAP waves. Like, where's the canonical data set that shows that? There's a lot of, let's say, anecdotal information and certainly witness testimony that's a correlation between UAP and nuclear sites, but where's the definitive data set that shows that, right? So what's the temporal, geospatial, geopolitical, even celestial, geophysical kind of correlations, right? Does it correlate with Earth lights? Does it correlate with, you know, politics? Does it correlate with, you know, troop movements? Like, what does it correlate to?
You know, and I think what that calls into a need for is there going to be eventually a database of databases? Because, you know, even at the meeting in the last couple of days, I've had people say, well, we're collecting this on experiencers, or we're collecting this type of data, or this kind of data, and I hear the same data sets being collected in 4 or 5 different places. And so that's repetitive action that doesn't need to be done. But, you know, on one hand, you'd hope that those databases validate each other, and they're, at best, you'd hope that they're synergistic.
Right, right. So sort of moving down sort of the problem list, there's sort of the hard science, you know, physics, material science. You talked about biology a little bit, but so if we like think about material science, you know, Richard Feynman sort of talked about this idea of room at the bottom, right? And it seems like, you know, technology's finally getting to the point where we can
You should
engineer.
explain what he meant by that.
Oh, right. So he was pretty much saying like that there's opportunity to engineer at the molecular level. We can actually, there's more opportunity space in terms of science, material science, and technology at the molecular level than at the macrostructural level. And it seems like we're finally getting to the stage where that's sort of viable. Like, we've been doing that in semiconductor for decades. We've done that obviously in genomics. But as this becomes more widely possible, the barriers to these disciplines seem to be eroding, and the possibility of creating a material infrastructure that's really, you know, engineered. And so the idea of programmable matter and information and material science start to merge. Some more advanced civilization may have already gotten to that stage.
So I think the true Hilbert problem here in material science is, you know, there's form and function. So form defines the function. So we don't yet know how to make certain kinds of materials. I can put the atoms there, let's say, but I don't necessarily have the ability to make the atomic structure bonds that are required to create the necessary structure to carry out the function. And so the Hilbert problem here is, and so this is sort of like a challenge to material scientists at large, is how do you create ab initio the positioning of 2 atoms and then a bond at a macro level in a material in 3D. You can't just like print them like clay dots, or like even the more advanced printing of 3D materials today. We're still sintering stuff, melting it onto itself or polymerizing it onto itself. So how do we make a superconductor, which anybody who's seen some of those zeolite-like structures that look like these beautiful 3D objects, how are you going to print that? And if we are dealing with materials, as some people claim exist from such objects, where they seem to be made almost as if they were instantiated out of the quantum foam, at desire, what kind of technology is required to accomplish that? And yeah, I don't have a materializer yet, but what would be the steps along the way to get to the materializer?
So the second part is, okay, you know, you ought to get like a finder's fee for it, and you ought to get compensated for, you know, the expenses in securing it and in, you know, in analyzing it. And this actually bears a lot of resemblance to the law of the sea in terms of marine salvage, right? So the idea of like if you find a vessel adrift at sea, you can't just keep it for yourself, right? You got to like bring it into port, and then the owner kind of gives you a finder's fee, right? It's sort of to reduce piracy, but also sort of incentivize the reintroduction of the cargo back into the streams of commerce, right? So you don't want piracy, but you want the material returned. And so this problem actually bears a lot of resemblance to that, because what we're talking about in the Schumer Amendment is specifically non-human technology. Like it's defined as non-human. So the owner is like non-human intelligence.
So let me stop you there because it's interesting. So somebody claims that they've got something and they bring it to you, but it's non-functional, it's a piece of broken something. How do you prove that what you had was that rather than an airplane part?
Right. Well, like
or a hoax.
Yeah, of course, right. So the amendment basically says that the board's got to adjudicate that beyond reasonable doubt. Like the standard in the amendment is reasonable doubt. So how is the board going to do that? Well, if the controlling authority brings it forward under the statute, then they're presuming that it is non-human intelligence, or they wouldn't have brought it forward, right?
So
but if the government is claiming that, then that would have to be demonstrated, and they'd probably come to experts to do that demonstration.
So there's got to be a chain of custody. There's got to be form and or function and proof, because who's going to invest in it if there's not that associated with it? And so there has to be laws and things set up for that.
So should we talk about, in the last couple of minutes,
Yep.
the healthcare aspect? Do we want to do that? Sort of this kind of tees off on the experiencer aspect of the thing. And so the idea of like wellness and health sort of comes into play in terms of potentially the ontological or psychological impacts that might come from interaction, but also if there's sort of a public revelation, there could be societal impacts as well. And so, in a sociological sense, that's sort of theoretical, but in the sort of prophylactic and medical healthcare side, would you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, the medical aspect, I mean, that's what got me involved in the first place. For those of you who don't know, I mean, when I got the knock on my door to say, can you help us with these patients, it wasn't because I had any interest necessarily in UAP or UFO. It was because they wanted access to the technology that my lab had developed around blood research. And so I think where that led to, basically us seeing the first of the Havana syndrome patients, I think, basically informed me about the other kinds of trauma that either our defense personnel or intelligence personnel were going through, and the experiencer side. Now, I sometimes get criticized for not wanting to talk about experiencers. It's not because it's just I'm not a psychiatrist and I don't have the qualifications to cover it. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed. I mean, there's a step beyond the mental health, and that's the bodily health. If people have come in contact with field structures that supposedly these craft might allegedly make, what do we learn about the field structures and what it does to humanity?